Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michelle de Albacajas, and I am a counselor in the Housing and Tenant Protections Division at the LA County Department of Consumer and Business Affairs, or most commonly known as DCBA. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Mary and Scott. They will also be joining us later on in the presentation for the Q&A portion of our event tonight. Today, I'll be sharing an update on tenant protections in the county.
And I'd also just like to say, I'm sorry to chime in, but I'd also just like to say, remind everyone that's joined this webinar will be posted, recorded and posted to the DCBA website, as well as this PowerPoint. I think
Thanks,
we can go
Mike.
to
we can go to the next
page.
slide. Thank you. So a preview of what I'll cover today. I'll give a brief introduction of the Housing and Tenant Protections Division and what's under our purview, an update on the status of the county's emergency tenant protections, share what permanent tenant protections currently exist in the county, and discuss upcoming financial assistance programs designed to support our county rental property owners. Next slide, please. A little about the Housing and Tenant Protections team. DCBA has worked in the space of landlord tenant assistance for years, but the team was formed in 2018 to implement board initiatives aimed to protect vulnerable tenants. The division oversees and enforces the county's 2 rent stabilization ordinances, one for brick and mortar rental units and one for space rent in mobile home parks, and supports the Rental Housing Oversight Commission, which serves as the appellate body for our staff level decisions. As we all know, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the division pivoted to also implement the county's COVID-19 Tenant Protections Resolution, formerly known as the eviction moratorium. We also oversee and administer Stay Housed LA, the county's branded eviction defense program. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next, I'd like to provide an update on the status of the county's COVID tenant protections. I'd like to recognize that these protections have evolved over time, and given all of the jurisdictions in the county and federal and state level protections implemented during the pandemic, that this is confusing. But my goal is to provide you a high level overview of what's in place for the county as protections expired on March 31st, 2023. However, there are a few protections in the resolution that were extended beyond March 2023. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what was the county's COVID-19 Tenant Protections Resolution? The resolution, effective March 4th, 2020 through March 31st, 2023, placed a countywide ban on most evictions for residential, including mobile home space renters who were impacted by COVID-19. The county's resolution applied to incorporated cities within the county, ensuring that there was a baseline of protections for all residents, unless a city's moratorium offered stronger protections. Then in that case, the city's moratorium prevailed over the county's for those tenants. The next slide, please. On February 28th, 2023, the Board of Supervisors voted to end the local emergency declared on COVID-19, which also marked the end of the county's resolution, with both expiring on March 31st, 2023. Now, Mike, I'd like to pivot to getting some polls pulled up for folks. Now, there are some poll questions that are going to be pulled up. For those of you that are joining us through telephone, we are going to be sharing out these polls via email as well. So this is something you will be able to participate in at a later time.
Thank you, Michelle. We're going to keep this poll open for about a minute and then close it. So make sure to get your responses in. You should something should have popped up on your screen with the question and some responses to help the DCBA's future work in the area. So thank you, and please fill that out. And like Michelle said, we also have an email available. I'm going to put in the chat along with some very useful and common links. If you have any comments or want to participate in this poll, but can't at the moment, maybe you're on your phone or things like that, please reach out. Okay, we'll be closing the poll in just about 15 more seconds, so please vote if you haven't yet. Okay, we are closing the poll now and moving on. Thank you everyone for voting, and we will be opening more polls throughout this webinar.
Thank you, Mike. And thanks, folks, for participating on the polls. They're very, very helpful to us as well. Okay. So what does the expiration of the resolution mean? Now, although the county's resolution has expired, I do want to take a moment to highlight what the expiration of emergency tenant protections means. Okay. Now, for most evictions for residential tenants and mobile home space renters, this means that they may resume as normal, except for no-fault evictions for the tenants who had exercised the county's non-payment of rent protections. Okay. Now, this also means that tenants must resume making rent payments as normal to avoid being evicted. As of April 1st, 2023, there will no longer be non-payment of rent protections in place. Okay. Now, for tenants who utilize the county's non-payment of rent protections, they still have 12 months to repay past due rent. For example, if I, as a renter, was unable to pay rent July of 2022, my 12-month repayment plan or repayment would begin August of 2022, and I would have 12 months to repay. Now, if I also owed August of 2022, the repayment period would start September 2022, and so on and so forth. Okay. The expiration of the resolution also means that rent increases may be issued for rent stabilized units, spaces in unincorporated LA County in accordance with the county's rent stabilization ordinances. There is a 3% cap for the 2023 calendar year, and luxury units are capped at 5%. While the emergency protections expired, there are still permanent tenant protections in place for unincorporated LA County and some incorporated cities. It is very important to verify the jurisdiction of the property and ensure that you are up to date with any permanent protections that may apply to the rental property. Next slide, please. So what protection survived the expiration of the resolution? For tenants who utilize the county's non-payment of rent protections between July 2022 and March 31st, 2023, they will still be protected against eviction for no fault eviction reasons, except for qualified owner move-in, anti-harassment and retaliation protections during the resolution's protection periods still apply. Starting April 1st, 2023, landlords are required to serve tenants with a written 30-day notice prior to filing an eviction based on non-payment of rent for rent that was accrued during the protected period. Specifically July 1st, 2022 through March 31st, 2023. Okay. Now for those tenants who have unauthorized occupants or pets in their units who began residing in the unit between March 2020 and January 20th of 2023, starting April 1st, 2023, landlords are required to serve tenants with a written 30-day notice prior to filing an eviction based on the presence of unauthorized occupants or pets. Next slide, please. Now, while emergency tenant protections have expired, I would like to take some time to discuss the permanent protections in place for most rental units and mobile home spaces located in unincorporated LA County. There are also many incorporated cities like the city of LA, West Hollywood, Santa Monica, and Beverly Hills, just to name a few, who also have permanent tenant protections in place. Again, as I mentioned, it is important to verify jurisdiction and whether any permanent protections may apply. Okay. The first of the rent stabilization ordinances under the LA County jurisdiction is the Rent Stabilization and Tenant Protections Unit, also known as the RSTPO. Mike, are we on the next screen?
There we go.
Thank you so much. Now, as I mentioned, the Rent Stabilization and Tenant Protections Unit is also known as RSTPO. Now, this ordinance does predate the temporary protections under the county's resolution and will continue as a permanent rent stabilization ordinance in the unincorporated LA County. Okay, the RSTPO limits annual rent increases specifically for fully covered units, prohibits property owners from evicting tenants without a just cause reason. It requires relocation assistance for no-fault evictions and temporary displacements. It protects tenants from retaliatory evictions and harassment. It requires landlords to register their units annually. And it also allows landlords to receive a fair return on their properties and pass through certain costs to the tenants. And lastly, it prohibits increases in security deposits. Again, this is for fully covered units. Next slide, please. Now, applicability of the RSTPO does vary between fully and partially covered units. And I'm going to break that down for you folks. A fully covered unit is located in unincorporated LA County. It has dwellings with 2 or more units on the property, has a certificate of occupancy or equivalent permit issued on or before February 1st, 1995. And mobile homes that are rented to tenants are also considered fully covered. Okay. A partially covered unit is different in that it is also located in unincorporated LA County. But this could also be any multifamily dwelling unit that was built after February 1st, 1995. This includes single family homes and condos unless exempt. And some examples of exempt properties are hotels, motels, other facilities by transient guests, institutional facilities, government-owned housing, etc. It is important to note that illegal units are also covered under the RSTPO. For example, if you have a single family home and it's subdivided into 2 separate units, that rental property may be considered fully covered, okay? And you know what, Mike, I think right here would be a good spot for us to share out another poll question for our guests.
Great. Just launching that poll now. Like the last poll, everyone, it'll be open for about 2 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and close it. But please, you should have just gotten a prompt pop up on your screen. Please go ahead and vote and participate in the poll. It's really useful information for us. I'm sorry, everyone. I actually just realized that was the same poll. I'm going to end that one and launch a different question. I'm really sorry about that, and we'll still keep this one open for 2 minutes. I'm going to keep this poll open for about 1 more minute. So please vote if you see this on your screen. About over half of everyone here has voted, so we appreciate that. And yeah, close this and move on shortly. Okay, we'll be closing the poll in just about 15 more seconds. The question is about the services DCBA offers on its website and other things like that to communicate. You can find a lot of these links in the chat, so please refer to the chat for really common and useful links. And we're going to go ahead and close the poll now and move on. So thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much to the voters. Now let's segue into permitted rent increases. Okay, so I want to provide a very brief overview of the permitted rent increases for fully covered units in the county. Okay, so from April 1st, 2023, for the remainder of the year, so through December 31st, 2023, rent increases are capped at 3%, and luxury units are capped at 5%. Okay. A landlord is only able to increase rent once in a 12-month period. And rent banking is not allowed. And for example, let's say in 2017, the county's rent cap was 4%. And in 2018, the county's rent cap was 3%. But I, as a landlord, opted to not raise rent for the past 2 years. However, now as a landlord, I'm not going to be able to raise 7% in this upcoming year in 2019, just because I did not raise rent in the last 2 years. So what no rent banking means is that a landlord either uses it or loses it. Okay. And then with regards to absolute rent cap, the absolute rent cap is 8% in any given year, or 10% for luxury units, which expires at the end of 2023. This also includes any pass-throughs unless otherwise determined by DCBA. Okay, and lastly, an addition of occupants does not authorize a rent increase or an increased security deposit. Next slide, please. Now that we've touched a little bit on permitted rent increases, I want to shed a little light on landlords terminating tenancies for rental properties that are subject to the county's permanent ordinance, or RSTPO. Okay. Landlords are required to send a copy of the notice of termination of tenancy, whether it be an at-fault or no-fault reason, along with the proof of service to DCBA within 5 days of serving the tenant the notice of termination. As you can see on the screen, we have provided you some examples of at-fault and no-fault evictions. We can see on the at-fault column, nuisance or illegal purpose, violation of material term of rental agreement, failure to vacate as required by approved relocation specialists, and households exceeding income limits and government regulated units. On the right column, we'll see no fault evictions. Again, this is some examples of what would fall under that category. One could be landlord or landlord's family member to move into the unit. Another would be an Alice Act eviction, which would constitute the withdrawal of dwelling unit from the rental market, or a government agency or court order. Next slide, please. Next, I want to jump into discussing the county's permanent protections in place for mobile home space renters. The second of the rent stabilized ordinances under our jurisdiction. The Mobile Home Rent Stabilization and Mobile Home Owner Protection Ordinance, also known as MRS-MOPO, or we like to call it Mrs. MOPO. It's quite a long acronym. But much like the RSTPO, Mrs. MOPO is a permanent protection in place for the county, which also predates the temporary protections under the county resolution and will continue as a permanent rent stabilization ordinance in the county. Now, the MRS-MOPO limits annual rent increases. It allows park owners to receive a fair return and pass through certain costs to mobile home owners, and requires park owners to register their spaces annually. Now, applicability of the MRS-MOPO extends to mobile homes located in the unincorporated areas of LA County. They're constructed before January 1st, 1990. And those with short-term leases, month-to-month, or long-term leases that were entered into after February 13th, 2020. It is important to note that long-term lease agreements will stop being exempt from local rent stabilization on January 1st, 2025. Next slide, please. Just as the fully covered units subject to the RSTPO have rent increase limitations, the MRS MOPO has similar permitted rent increases. Base rent was established on February 13th, 2018, or initiation of the tenancy. Okay. Annual rent increases are limited to 75% of the change in the average CPI over the previous 12-month period ending in September, or 3% of the rent charged at the time of increase, whichever is greater. Okay. But I do want to make a note that a minimum of 3% is always guaranteed under the MRS MOPO. A park owner is only able to increase rent once in a 12-month period, similar to the RSTPO. And also rent banking is prohibited. And we'll refer to the same example that I mentioned earlier for the RSTPO. Again, let's say in 2017, the county's rent cap was 4%. And in 2018, the county's rent cap was 3%. But the mobile home park owner opted to not raise rent for the last 2 years. And now the mobile home park owner is unable to raise it 7% in 2019 because they did not raise it in the last 2 years. So again, park owners either use it or lose it. Now the absolute rent cap is 8% in any given year, unless otherwise approved by DCBA. And all rent increase notices do require a minimum of 90 days written notice. And this is regardless of the percentage of the increase in rent. When there is a vacancy, sale, or title change, the permitted rent increase depends on if there was an existing lease transferred to a current occupant or a qualified relative, if there was already a rent increase in the previous 12 months. Max rent increase of 10% if not. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, a key component of the Housing and Tenant Protections Division is the Rental Housing Oversight Commission, also known as the ROC. The role of the ROC is to make determinations and resolves appeals of decisions made by the county. The ROC safeguards tenants and mobile home owners from rent increases that are inconsistent with the county code. And it also ensures that landlords and mobile home park owners receive fair return on their properties. Lastly, the ROC oversees the mobile home park closure, conversion, or change of use, and relocation impact reports. Mike, I want to go ahead and call upon the poll question for our guests. I'll go ahead and mute myself. Thank you.
Launching our final poll question for today. While everyone votes, I'm also going to post the common and useful links again in the chat, just for ease of reference. So please take a moment to jot those down or paste them into another document for your use. We're going to keep this poll open for just about 1 more minute. So please vote if you haven't yet. And thank you everyone for participating. It's really useful information. Okay, we'll keep this poll open for just about 15 more seconds. So please vote if you haven't yet. And keep in mind, we will have a Q&A session once the presentation is over. Okay, closing the poll now, and I'll hand it back to Michelle. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. All right. So while the board took action to enact much needed temporary emergency tenant protections during such a critical time, we do understand the impacts property owners have also faced during the pandemic. You may have noticed just a few moments ago, Mike was sharing out the common links at the middle of the presentation. That will be shared again later towards our Q&A portion. Okay, this list consists of resources available to property owners offered by DCBA. So be sure to make note of the compiled list the department has made for your reference. During the next couple of slides, I will be discussing proposed financial assistance programs designed to support our county rental property owners. Next slide, please. So I will be highlighting, again, some financial assistance programs that are currently in development. DCBA will be launching round 2 of the mortgage relief program for property owners who experience financial hardship. The program may offer relief up to $30,000 in relief. Further details and updates on the program will be posted to our DCBA website. DCBA is also working on launching a rent relief program that would prioritize assistance to properties owned by mom and pop landlords and low-income tenants. DCBA is working on the development and implementation of the program, and a report back was filed with the board containing recommended framework for this, for what this program could look like. DCBA will be posting updates as they become available. Also, a mom and pop non-mortgage assistance program is coming soon. $3 million to a mom and pop non-mortgage program. This is being designed as a complement to the mortgage relief partnership, which we just discussed. The proposed program will assist distressed mom and pop landlords who have been financially impacted by the pandemic and have been unable to collect rent. Under this recommended framework, landlords would receive up to $30,000 in direct financial assistance to cover qualifying non-mortgage expenses related to the preservation, maintenance, and general upkeep of their property. Next slide, please. I would like to share information on additional services provided by other programs in DCBA. For example, our foreclosure prevention program, they assist homeowners experiencing financial difficulty and are having trouble paying their mortgage, which may benefit from services provided through this program. Our counselors can provide options, counseling, along with appropriate referrals and resources, mediate mortgages, liens with lien holders, and help provide vital resources and assistance when faced with a foreclosure. We will be sharing out contact information for this specific program at the end of the presentation. Another popular service offered through DCBA is our free mediation services, also known as dispute resolution services, to assist landlords and tenants with support from a third neutral party to resolve disputes outside of court. The mediation services are voluntary and confidential. Parties still have the option to go to court if they are unable to resolve the dispute. This is especially helpful for those folks that want to present a repayment plan. This has been very popular throughout the pandemic. So please, be on the alert for these other services that are being offered through DCBA. Next slide, please. Now, before we jump into the Q&A, I would like to provide contact information for the department. While I am presenting on behalf of Housing and Tenant Protections Division, I discussed multiple programs offered through DCBA. All of these programs can be reached by dialing 800-593-8222 or by visiting the department's website, as you can see on the screen, dcba.lacounty.gov. I have also provided additional contact information for our program and the foreclosure prevention team on this slide to remain updated on relevant information and program launches. We definitely encourage you to sign up for email notifications by visiting our department's website. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'll go ahead and open up the chat for folks. And if you have a question you want to ask verbally, please use the raise hand feature, the virtual raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom, and you may be asked to unmute and ask your question. Thanks, everyone. I can go ahead and unmute someone if you'd like.
Hi, Mike. This is Mary Safarian with DCBA. We have a bunch of questions in the Q&A section that we're currently working through, but did see a consistency of a question of the questions asking for a copy of the presentation along with the links. You should be able to copy and paste the links now that the chat is live. So please take that opportunity to do so. In addition, once we wrap up the presentation along with the recording of the presentation and the information we shared, such as the links, will be sent over to those that registered for the webinar via email. So you will have that information as well. Seeing a lot of questions coming in asking whether or not there's permanent protections apply to certain cities. For example, is Rancho Palos Verdes in an unincorporated area of the county? We do need the full address in order to look up the jurisdiction of the property. And we do need to have the address and have the jurisdiction verified in order to then provide information on the applicable protections that may be in place countywide, or may be in place for unincorporated LA County versus incorporated cities. So please give us a call directly so that we can go ahead and pull up the property information and provide counseling based on location of the rental property. Seeing lots of questions about rent increases. Michelle, during the second part of the presentation, went into rent increase restrictions. And those restrictions are applicable to rent stabilized units and mobile home spaces for the county's rent stabilized ordinances. Again, we would need the address to determine applicability of these protections. For those that are reaching out or have questions related to incorporated cities, we do encourage you to reach out to your local city hall. There are some jurisdictions, to name a few: City of LA, Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, and of course, I'm going blank on several others that do currently have permanent tenant protections in place. So if your property falls within an incorporated area, please reach out to your city directly. We are not going to have an opportunity to unfortunately pull up the addresses now to verify that over the during the webinar. So please reach out to our department directly so that we can provide that information. Seeing questions regarding notices of termination and the requirement to submit a copy of the notice of termination that is served to the tenant. That is applicable to the eviction restrictions per our ordinances that Michelle mentioned. Again, this is for the rent stabilized tenant protections ordinance and the mobile home, the Mrs. Mopo, to say for short. So the notice requirement is for those units. In addition to that, I want to ensure this is clear. There's still some protections that survive the resolution. One of those protections is no fault protections for tenants who exercise their rights to the non-payment of rent in the event they were unable to pay due to COVID-19. And this is for tenants who are financially impacted and were found income qualified between July 2022 through March 2023. So if those tenants were subject to the county's protections, they will continue to be protected against no fault evictions. Again, to ensure this is clear, this is applicable county-wide. So what this means is if you are attempting to evict your tenant to move into the property yourself or to move in a qualified family member, you must still follow the requirements of landlord or landlord family member move-in. We do have this information posted to our website. Please ensure that you review our website for all relevant forms that need to be completed. And if further clarification is needed, we ask that you reach out to our department. Single family homes in an unincorporated area have rent increase restrictions as well. No, the rent increase restriction is only applicable to to fully covered units. If it's a true single family home, meaning there is no other unit that's on the property, whether it's legally registered or not, that is considered or may be considered a partially covered unit unless it's completely exempt from the chapter. There are a list of reasons a property can be exempt under the chapter. We will not be covering that throughout the presentation. So please make sure to contact our office or visit our website so that you can pull up a list of exemption reasons.
I see a question, Mary. This is from Elisa. She has 3 units in unincorporated LA County. The rents are under market, and she wants to know if she can raise the rent more than 3%. If the units were built in 1995 or issued a certificate of occupancy on February 1, 1995 or older, the rent cap is 3%. However, there is a process in which a landlord or a property owner can submit an application for a rent adjustment on the property if they think that they are not receiving a fair market return on the property. The onus is on the property owner to provide documentation showing that their costs have increased in certain areas and their rents have stayed the same or not kept up with those costs. This is something that would be reviewed administratively within the department and by the previously mentioned Rental Housing Oversight Commission, potentially, to determine whether or not an increase over that 3% is allowed or not. So bottom line is there is a process if a landlord thinks that, they're not receiving a fair market return on their property, but they do have to go through that process, which, does entail providing documentation and proof of, their costs and expenses and their rental income, and then a determination would be made based on that information that's provided.
Scott, I'm seeing a few questions from folks regarding city RSO and their ability to raise rent, and even questions on, how do I determine the jurisdiction to know if tenants are entitled to relocation assistance? I'd like to refer back to the common links list that Mike shared halfway through the presentation, which he can also share out again for folks. That list has a section there where it allows you to look up jurisdiction. So when it comes to rent increases for rent stabilized units and relocation assistance in general, it does boil down to jurisdiction and whether or not it's a rent stabilized unit and subject to just cause eviction provisions. Again, as Mary mentioned, oftentimes we encourage you guys to give us a call to share the address so that we can give you the most accurate information available. But for folks that are asking about the rent increases for your city rent stabilized units, the permitted percentage and the ability to raise rent that we discussed here today only applies to the county's rent stabilized units. If you'd like to determine the percentage you're able to raise rent or when you're able to do so for City of LA RSO, I would encourage you to reach out to the LA Housing Department so that they can give you further guidance.
Great, thank you, Michelle. There's another question. This is from Paulina. What if a tenant does not want to sign an updated lease and the rental unit is located in unincorporated LA County, which is the county's jurisdiction? The county does, so the RSO states that if a tenant is presented with a lease that is substantially similar to their previous lease and they're unwilling to sign it, then that tenant can be evicted for that reason. If there are changes that are different from the original lease, other than the dates and some minor things, then that isn't a lease that the tenant can sign or should sign. The ordinance prevents changes to lease terms other than some minor changes. So it would have to be a substantially similar lease that is presented to the tenant. If they still refuse to sign that lease, then you may potentially have grounds to evict that tenant for violating the RSTPO for the county. So, a lot of these questions are very case specific. And so we can provide some general guidance, but it really depends on the particular situation and what the changes to the lease were and whether or not those changes were substantial or significant or not. So I would suggest, speaking to an attorney, calling our office just to provide further details so that we can make at least a better determination as to what would apply here. Okay. We've got a question from Carmen. Can I return my tenant's rent? I want to evict instead. Again, that's very case specific. It depends on where the rental property is located and what rules apply and what protections, if any, are in place. That's going to determine whether or not the whether or not Carmen can actually evict these tenants instead. I would suggest speaking to an attorney just to be on the safe side. Okay, you're an unincorporated LA County. As was discussed in this presentation, you can't just evict because you want to evict someone. There are protections that say you have to have cause or good cause or just cause to evict a tenant. Those are the rules that apply to unincorporated LA County, and that's what was covered in this presentation by Michelle. I see a question about rent relief. The state rent relief program, which was housing is key, ended a year ago. So the rent relief that was available ended March 31st, 2022. The question is, can a landlord find out if a tenant receives any rent relief? Well, the state rent relief program required that the landlord participate in the application process in order for a tenant to be provided with assistance. So I don't think there'd be a way that a landlord wouldn't know if a tenant received rental assistance through the state program. And that's really about all I have on that.
Mike, is it possible for you to share the common links list that we compiled for folks? A lot of questions are coming in regarding jurisdiction. How do I know if it's city? How do I know if it's county? How do I know if it's unincorporated? I think if we share that out for folks, they'll see on there that there's an option to look up jurisdiction and other resources for landlords.
Just shared, and for folks, jurisdiction lookup is third from the bottom link.
And then to add to the jurisdiction information, we do also have information, a link listed for LA City RSO lookup. I'm seeing lots of questions coming in, whether or not specific cities within City of LA are subject to rent restrictions. You can visit zimas.lacity.org and you can look up the address. It will actually identify, there's a drop down and you will be able to identify applicability of the city's RSO, but we do also recommend that you reach out to the city directly in case any information is posted incorrectly. Seeing lots of questions, and we'll just take a couple more questions as we're nearing 7 o'clock. Seeing lots of questions coming in about rent registration requirements. The rent registration requirement that Michelle spoke to during the presentation is for units, residential units and mobile home spaces that are subject to the county's ordinances. So if you are just unsure about the jurisdiction of your property, the applicability of these ordinances that were discussed, and the ordinances that I'm referring to is during the second part of the presentation, Michelle went over permanent protections. Please give our department a call. I am also going to drop in a link where you can actually schedule a phone appointment with the department. We are heavily impacted with the protections, with emergency tenant protections expiring. Unfortunately, our department is currently experiencing high call volumes, and we foresee that being the case as we kind of continue on with the expiration of these protections. So if you would like to schedule an appointment to either speak to a counselor during a dedicated 30-minute session or for an in-person appointment, I am dropping the link now. Please utilize the link so that you can schedule that appointment and come into the office. If a property is fully covered, I'm sorry, one more last question and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. If a property is fully covered under the county's rent stabilized ordinance, the rent cap is currently set at 3%, and Scott discussed in which situations or what steps property owners would take to essentially submit an application for fair return. We are actively working on getting the updated application posted to the website along with relevant forms. So please circle back with any updates. And with that, we are at the end of the presentation. We do apologize. We could not get to every single question coming in. We hope this information was helpful. There will be a follow-up email sent with the presentation link, the slides, and also the list of links that were shared out during the presentation. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate.
I'm gonna keep this Zoom open for one more minute or so to copy down links if you need them. Thank you. Okay, ending the meeting now. Thank you for attending, everyone. Have a great rest of your night.